All right, well, welcome everyone to our webinar previewing the 117th Congress and the legislative issues that are likely to impact CTE this year. I'm Alicia Heislip. I'm ACTE's Senior Director of Public Policy, and we thank you for giving up an hour of what we know is a very busy schedules around the country to be here and to hear all of our updates this afternoon. Before we dive in, I do have to say that when we scheduled this webinar back in the fall, we could have not even imagined what the last week in DC and around the country would have looked like. I hope you saw some of our thoughts on the blog earlier this week. You know, we, like all of you, have watched in horror as events unfolded at the Capitol. We're members of the DC community. You know, we've walked those halls. We have friends and colleagues that serve in those offices every day. And so everything has been deeply personal, as well as, of course, we've realized the significance of the attacks on our democracy and the peaceful transition of power, and all of the ramifications and difficult realities that are coming to light because of what happened last week. In some ways, that makes the conversations that we're going to have here today seem much less important than they might have a few weeks ago. And we know that the ramifications of the insurrection will be felt throughout this Congress in ways that are just beginning to be illuminated and articulated, and that, you know, we don't have a crystal ball to kind of predict how some of them might play out. But we still wanted to give you information that we think will be important as things start to return to regular order. Like many of our partner organizations, we've currently paused our congressional lobbying out of respect for the more pressing issues that Hill staff are considering. But as we'll share throughout the presentation, there will be many opportunities throughout the year to impact the domestic policy agenda and share the message about CTE and the benefits that CTE can have to a country going through the economic crisis that we are moving forward. So we wanted to go ahead with today's webinar, even in the midst of these very challenging, uncertain times, in hopes of giving you just a little bit of preparation for what will eventually come, that return to regular order in Congress and the beginning of the new administration. So we're happy to attempt to answer any questions you have, particularly about the processes that are playing out, but certainly about how things might impact the CTE agenda and all moving forward. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to turn things over to Mike Matthews, our Government Relations Manager, and he is going to start by looking back just a little bit about the outcomes of the election and the impacts that that is likely to have on the leaders that impact CTE issues in Congress and the administration. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Alicia.
One thing before you get started, I should have mentioned, if you have any questions, we'll stop periodically throughout the presentation to grab those, but feel free to drop them in the chat at any time, and I'll be monitoring that. And if they're really timely, I might interrupt Mike and get that question answered or we'll stop at the end of sections. So feel free to drop them in the chat, but we'll also open up the microphones at different times for you to weigh in as well. So sorry about that. Now you can go ahead, Mike.
No problem at all. Welcome, everybody. And just like Alicia said, thank you for coming today. I'm going to go really briefly through the 2020 election kind of results and recap, just because I think the past 3 months, we've all seen it every single day on the TV. But Alicia, if you could go to the next slide, we'll start with the presidential election. And this election saw the highest voter turnout actually in the percentage of eligible voter population since the election in 1900, with over 150 million Americans voting. Obviously, we all know by now, President-elect Biden won the Electoral College with 306 votes to President Trump's 232, and he also won the popular vote by about 7 million votes. Another thing I should note too, just really briefly, that was kind of note from the presidential election was this is the first time ever an incumbent not only lost re-election, but both chambers of Congress within that first term. So if you could go to the next slide. So the House of Representatives Obviously, the Democrats held on to the majority, but I wouldn't categorize it as a victory for them by no means. They lost 11 net seats, and kind of with the run up to the election, the vigor behind the campaign of President Biden, the enthusiasm, the vast fundraising efforts that they had, they really underperformed not only in the House but in the Senate, which we'll go to later. But currently, they still hold a 10-seat majority, which is actually the smallest since 2000. And for Democrats, it's the smallest they had since 1942. Then another thing to note, I think it's pretty important, especially with the ability of getting policy passed. The majority will further shrink in about 2 weeks when President-elect Biden is sworn in, because he appointed 3 House members to various roles within the administration. So going on to the Senate, obviously going into the general election in November, Democrats were in the minority, only having 47 seats. So they needed a net gain of 4 or 3 in the vice presidency to gain a majority. And like I just previously mentioned, despite record-breaking turnout fundraising efforts, Democrats really underperformed. They failed to flip several seats in races that were considered competitive that weren't in the past. It was Colorado and some other seats, with only their gains on election night being Arizona and Colorado, while they lost a seat in Alabama. So this, up until the runoff in Georgia, this left the Senate 50 to 48 in Republican control. Like I said, until January 5th, when the 2 runoffs took place. Obviously, we know now that John Ossoff and Reverend Warnock won both Georgia seats, giving Senate a 50-50 tie, where Vice President Harris will act as the tiebreaker, giving Dems control. Again, this is the first time since 2000 that the Senate was tied. It's only happened, I believe, 3 times throughout our entire history. So next slide, please. So now we'll kind of go into noteworthy federal leaders, both within the administration and within both chambers of Congress. So obviously, starting with the president-elect himself, Joseph Biden, former vice president and senator from Delaware for 36 years. He led a lot of various efforts, especially on foreign affairs in his time in the Senate. He was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And then in the vice presidency role, he played a larger domestic policy, especially when it came around community colleges and President Obama's effort to make community college more affordable for more of our students. Next, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. She's currently a senator from California, former California Attorney General. During her time in the Senate, she's introduced and supported CTE and workforce proposals, including co-sponsoring the College Transparency Act, which is a bill where we publicly endorsed and we're really trying to get across the finish line this year. Next, I usually wouldn't put the First Lady in notable people, but given Dr. Jill Biden's background in education, I thought it's critically important that we mention her. Currently, she's a teacher of English at Northern Virginia Community College, which she plans to continue actually teaching while she performs her duty as First Lady. She's a major advocate for community colleges and expressed an interest in playing a larger role than most First Ladies in higher ed policy. So the last person on the top right is his Labor Secretary nominee, who is Marty Walsh. He's the current mayor of Boston. He's a really strong proponent of organized labor. He's actually a former labor official and Massachusetts state legislator. During his time as mayor, he's led efforts to provide free community college, increase private sector involvement in education, expand apprenticeship programs, increase youth workforce activities, and expanded career pathways within the school system of the city. In the bottom left-hand corner is the Education Secretary nominee, Dr. Miguel Cardona. He's currently the Connecticut Education Commissioner. He's also a former teacher, principal, and assistant superintendent, which I think is noteworthy because one of President-elect Biden's one big commitment when it came to the education sector was ensuring that a former educator was the education secretary. To note, Dr. Cardona actually graduated from a technical high school as a part of an automotive studies program. And his major priorities, although not much information has kind of been put out, but gleaning off of President-elect Biden's policy priorities and kind of looking into Dr. Cardona's background, we believe his major priorities will include eliminating long-standing inequalities, closing racial and socioeconomic opportunity gaps, expanding access to community colleges, training programs, public four-year colleges and universities, and really improve student success, but also growing a stronger, more prosperous, and more inclusive middle class, which I think he's going to try to achieve through kind of making education more affordable and accessible to all people. He has a really strong K-12 background, but he has no real prior experience in post-secondary. So I think he'll rely heavily on his assistant secretaries in those roles, which we just have no prior information on yet. Next is Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. She's the current governor of Rhode Island. And then prior to being governor, she was a lawyer and hedge fund manager. Then last, Energy Secretary. So I normally wouldn't put this on there, but with energy being a large kind of policy priority for not only the Democrats in both the House and the Senate, but also the president himself, I thought it was pretty critical to mention her, especially given her background. Jennifer Granholm, she's the former governor and attorney general of Michigan. And then she founded and for 5 years was the chair of the American Jobs Prospect, which is a 24-state multi-university research project kind of focused on advanced manufacturing jobs and clean energy. This is why I think it's pretty important to kind of put her in the mix with these, because she has a strong background, both as her time in governor and post-governor in job creation, especially in the energy space. So going on to the notable priorities, I kind of put them in two buckets as they pertain to us, one being COVID-19 and the other one being education and workforce issues. So starting with COVID-19, I'll start with kind of the major high-level difference between the two administrations' approaches. I would categorize Trump's as kind of trying to portray a calm, everything is fine approach, while the Biden administration is really moving with like almost a soberness about them, kind of understanding the gravity of this issue. Kind of going off this, Biden actually today will be making a speech about his COVID-19 plan in more detail. So recently we've been hearing that it's going to be split into two pieces. The first piece being relief oriented, so ensuring the vaccine rollout and development, increasing hospital capacities, kind of shoring up our frontline workers, things like that. And then the second is going to be really focused on the recovery aspect. So now I'm just going to provide you with some of the tenets of his overall plan. These are all mainly taken from his website. So you can all look at his website and look at it in more detail. It's multiple pages, so I tried to boil it down to some of the bigger issues. And again, it depending on how it's packaged, it may look different than what I'm portraying now. But these are kind of the biggest priorities that I think he's going to try to attempt. The Biden administration has over and over kind of set themselves a goal of providing 100 million shots of the vaccine in the first 100 days. Basically, they aim to release nearly every available dose of the coronavirus vaccine immediately upon taking office, which is kind of a break from the Trump administration up until recently, who has become more reluctant on releasing additional vaccines. But they were really holding back about half of the U.S. vaccine production to ensure that the second doses were available. Currently, though, this plan is a little bit behind. The incoming administration is kind of concerned that they won't be able to meet the goal, and they're really citing the lack of cooperation early on in the transition process. They also feel that they're a little worried or concerned about Operation Warp Speed and how it was set up. It was really set up to focus on the vaccine development and really neglected to develop a streamlined plan and process to get the vaccines to people. So they really front loaded on the vaccine development and not really the rollout. Also, they're looking to do a PSA to ease the concern around vaccine hesitancy with kind of a scientific tilt to it. Other tenets of his plan include eliminating cost barriers for prevention and for care of COVID-19, immediately restoring the White House National Security Council Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense, which was established under the Obama-Biden administration and was actually eliminated by the Trump administration in 2018. And that directorate, their sole job is to detect these kind of outbreaks in other countries and kind of prevent them from coming here in the first place. He promised to provide daily White House reports on how many tests have been done and other relevant information. And he's also tasking all federal agencies to take immediate action to ensure that American hospital capacity can meet the growing demand. And like I said, there's many other points laid out in this plan. I just, given our time constraint, I didn't want to lay them all out. Like I said, if you guys want more detail, they're all on his website. Moving to the education priorities. Again, they've published numerous detailed plans. Education alone, they probably have, I don't know, 5 or 6 different multi-page plans laying out the education agenda for his administration. Each one kind of focusing on a separate part of the continuum. They have an early childhood education one, a K-12 one, a higher education one, including a plan for community college and career pathways, a teacher preparation and pay one for student loans, one for education funding, among other issues. So instead of going through all the policies, I'll just briefly hit on 3 points, kind of 3 policy agenda issues that should be of interest to you. The first one being school reopening, the other one being CTE and workforce, and the other one being teacher pay. So starting with school reopening, President-elect Biden has maintained that he would like to be able to safely reopen schools by the end of the first 100 days, and then also try and further stem the significant, basically to further stem the significant learning loss and social and emotional impacts our students have already incurred. This is also kind of the same viewpoint that the incoming Secretary of Education has. So I really see them actively trying to safely get students back to school as soon as possible. So next, with career and technical education. In general, it's expected that the Biden administration will seek to prioritize and invest heavily into our nation's workforce and education systems, especially in the face of the current kind of global pandemic, the recession that it's brought about, and then also kind of how these 2 events happening simultaneously has really sped up the technological shift within our economy. So that's also further exacerbating kind of our skills gap. So I really see them trying to stem that as much as possible. Further, his campaign has released, again, numerous proposals. So CTE and workforce were kind of in different places. They were in the K-12 one, the higher ed one. But again, he has specific policy proposals that will also be beneficial outside the education ones. He has a plan for our nation's caregiving and education workforce. So that calls for $1 billion over the next 4 years to recruit, retrain current and future professionals seeking careers in these fields. So your healthcare fields, your teacher fields, things like that. He also has a Made in America, a clean energy, a climate and infrastructure plan, all of which contain proposals to either directly or indirectly benefit the growth and support of CTE. This again goes back to why I kind of pointed out the energy secretary earlier in key people, because within his policy priorities, he has creation of job training programs that would lead to clean and renewable energy. But one of the most important proposals for CTE advocates, I think, in my opinion, is the Biden plan for education beyond high school. This proposal calls basically for providing 2 years of free community college and the creation of a new program designed to help community colleges improve student success, tackle the barriers that prevent students from completing their degree or training credential. And it also makes a $50 billion investment into high quality training programs. I should mention right here, although it just says community colleges, it's not just associate's degrees, it's basically 2 years and below. So there's no need to worry that this is going to kind of run counterproductive to current post-secondary CTE programs. And then lastly, the teacher pay and respect. This again is kind of broken down into multi-prongs, but the first one being a policy to ensure that teachers receive competitive wage and benefits. And in doing so, he plans on triple the funding for Title I, which is the federal program funding schools with a high percentage of students from low-income families, and basically require districts to use a portion of these new funds to offer educators competitive salaries. I think across the country, it's pretty common sense that unfortunately, a lot of lower socioeconomic school districts have a more difficult time filling roles for educators. So I think this is a way to kind of combat that and ensure that everybody has access to a quality education. The next prong is to invest in teacher mentoring, leadership, and additional education. So the Biden administration will help school districts create opportunities for teachers to lead beyond the classroom. They'll be able to serve as mentors and coaches to other teachers, as leaders of professional learning communities, and they'll be compensated for the additional work they take on. These funds will also be used to help teachers who choose to earn additional certifications in high demand areas like special education or bilingual education, while they're still teaching to do so without accumulating additional debt. And lastly, the administration plans to help teachers and other educators pay off their student loans. Basically, it's expected that one of the first things they'll do is to look at in fixing and simplifying the existing public service loan forgiveness program and ensure that it actually does help teachers. I don't know if you guys remember a couple months ago, a story came out that the Department of Ed actually denied over 99% of all people who applied for public service loan forgiveness. And they see that as a big disincentive to not only going into public service through government, but also through education and teaching professions. So they're really going to take a strong look at fixing and simplifying that program. So going now to the House of Representatives, with the House remaining under Democratic control, high-level leadership, the top four hasn't changed at all except their titles. Oh, well, they haven't changed at all, actually. Representative Nancy Pelosi is still the Speaker of the House. Representative Kevin McCarthy out of California remains the minority leader. One thing I would like to mention, though, is that the Speaker Pelosi actually received one of the narrowest margins during her Speaker election, only receiving about 7 or so more votes than against. This is kind of indicated to a few different things, but kind of a fracture within the Democratic Party. So I mentioned that just because that may play into effect of kind of policy getting done this Congress. And then also in the bottom left-hand corner, Mr. Hoyer from Maryland remains the majority leader, while Mr. Scalise from Louisiana remains the minority whip. Moving on to the committees, again, the two most important committees to us is the Education and Labor Committee and the Committee on Appropriations. Leadership on the Education and Labor Committee will remain the same. In the top left-hand corner, under committees, Representative Bobby Scott of Virginia, he will remain the chairman, while Virginia Fox will remain the ranking member. It's important to note, though, that Representative Susan Davis, who's a Democrat out of California, was the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Investment. She retired this Congress. And the reason I mention that is that committee oversees all post-secondary CTE and workforce-related policies. No new chair has been appointed yet, and we don't really have any indication of who's going to fill it yet. It's just something that we really need to pay attention to because they have say over about half of all CTE policy. Now moving on to the Appropriations Committee, the former chairwoman, Nita Lowey, who was a Democrat out of New York, retired. So we have a new chairwoman who is Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut. She was actually formerly the Labor H Subcommittee secretary, or not secretary, sorry, chairwoman. That's the Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies Committee. They oversee all labor issues, all education issues. She was actually voted to become the new full committee chairwoman, which is great for education advocates. She's long been a big proponent of education programs. I also like to mention that she played a proactive role in helping us get the increases we've actually seen in the last 4 budgets. So we're really heartened to see her kind of taking a more prominent role within the committee. And like I mentioned, CTE and education will remain a top priority of hers. And then the ranking member in the bottom right-hand corner will once again be Kate Granger out from Texas. And just like last thing for House of Representatives, you don't have to flip back. In terms of Rosa DeLauro's replacement on the subcommittee, like I mentioned, it's not known yet, just like Susan Davis. These issues kind of come to head once the committee meets for the first time. And I think appointments are still being finished on new committees. So that should happen in the next couple of weeks. We'll continue to update the CTE Policy Watch blog with any new updates. So continue to check that out to ensure that you're caught up with all of the new committee assignments. So moving on to the U.S. Senate. Again, it's pretty similar to the House with the top 4 leaders remaining the same. Obviously, the major difference being that the party in power has switched, which would make Senator Schumer the new majority leader and Senator McConnell the minority leader. And then that also makes Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois the majority whip, Senator John Thune the minority whip. From a committee standpoint, now Senator Patty Murray will be the new chairwoman of HELP, which is great for CTE advocates, as she's a member of the caucus and also a major supporter of workforce and CTE programs. She's been a long champion of those, so we're really glad to see her take helm of the committee. It's unclear who will be her counterpart on the Republican side. Currently, there is no ranking member that's been appointed yet. The longtime chair, Lamar Alexander, senator from Tennessee, actually retired at the end of last Congress. But the two most likely candidates to replace him are going to be Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina or Rand Paul out of Kentucky. The Senate, when it comes to committee leadership, they really rely on seniority more than anything else, and they're the next two people up on the committee. Number two was Senator Mike Enzi, who was the budget chairman, but he also retired at the end of last Congress as well. Then for appropriations, under committees in the bottom left, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont will become the chairman, and Richard Shelby, senator from Alabama, will become the ranking member. So moving on to the CTE Caucus, thankfully there was no changes in the caucus leadership after the elections. None of the senators were actually up for election that are the caucus co-chairs, the four. Senator Tim Kaine, Senator Rob Portman, Senator Tammy Baldwin, and then Senator Todd Young. And then the two in the House both won their re-elections. There were some losses in both chambers to membership due to retirement, lost elections, etc. But we fully expect those numbers to grow once again. Once members begin to kind of settle into their new roles and look at the caucuses that are available to join. I say that because many newly elected members, they really made a lot of mention and prioritized their interest and experience within CTE and kind of workforce development, again, given the backdrop of kind of the economic situation we're in right now. This is also a good time to mention, though, that if you have a new member of Congress that's not currently on the caucus, we implore you to reach out to them and ask them to join. It's obviously beneficial for us to have public support from our senators and congressmen, but it's also really beneficial to their offices. So again, we ask you to ask them to join next time you reach out to them.
All right, so with that, we're going to pause and see if anybody does have any questions. I haven't seen any in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself and jump in or to put a question in the chat. We'll pause here just a second to see if anyone has questions about what we've covered so far. In case anyone is typing, one thing I will add is that we have already begun our outreach to the incoming Biden administration. We have met with their transition team. We've also sent in materials and priorities. We've also met with Senator Murray's staff that's coming on as chairwoman of the HELP committee, as Mike mentioned, on her agenda and on the confirmation process for Biden nominations. As Mike said, we haven't heard yet who might be nominated as the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Career Technical and Adult Education, but we did put in some thoughts on that nomination as well. We're hopeful that they have some background and experience in CTE, and we'll definitely be sharing more about that person as soon as we hear who might be nominated. So I still don't see any questions, so I think we are good to keep going. Oh, wait. Okay, I see one now. Will Scott Stump still be a DOE? No, because Scott was the political appointee in the Office of Career Technical and Adult Education. He's in a Senate confirmed political position. He will not be there anymore after Tuesday or Wednesday, and there'll be a new person appointed that must go through the Senate confirmation process for that assistant secretary role. However, we just met with Scott last week and with Casey Sachs, his deputy, to kind of get all of their notes on what pieces they have in place that they want to make sure don't get lost. And there is a whole team of career staff at the Office of Career Technical and Adult Education that have been there a very long time and are wonderful to work with and make sure that initiatives continue and the focus continues on CTE moving forward. forward? So that's a great question. All right, well, Mike, I think you can move on to what to expect from Congress on the legislative front.
Awesome. So the first slide, obviously, the political environment is critically important to getting virtually anything done. But I think it's pretty self-explanatory, especially if you've been kind of watching the news the last few months, especially the last couple of weeks. It's pretty tough right now. Kind of given the backdrop of impeachment, the storming of the Capitol, and other recent developments, I imagine there's not going to be a real appetite, at least in the short term, for any bipartisan efforts, aside maybe from COVID relief. Both parties have really kind of dug in on a lot of these issues, especially with them being more foundational issues than policy disputes. I also want to say, like, additionally, like the newly elected members of Congress in both parties are really starting to push the outer bounds of ideology within both parties. And again, I expect this to further exacerbate the partisanship. And again, even if both parties could generally agree on a topic, the Senate still has the 60-vote cloture rule in place, which will make even marginally bipartisan issues even more difficult. The cloture rule essentially, in order to end debate on any proposal and get it to the floor for a vote, the Senate needs to take a cloture vote beforehand, which 60 members must vote in favor. Once that takes place, basically debate can end within 30 hours, and then the bill can be moved to the full chamber floor for a vote. There is a nuclear option, which you've seen in years past where they kind of bypassed this, but that's kind of seen as last resort. And I think if they're trying to move away from the partisanship, they're not going to entertain that issue. So moving on next to COVID-19. I'll kind of recap what's happened so far, at least as it relates to education. So there's been two previous relief bills that have included education funding, with the latest coming last month, but neither of which included dedicated funding for CTE programs. So back in March, the CARES Act provided just about $31 billion to education. And then last month, the package that was passed provided about $82 billion in education funding. We expect, or quite frankly know, that there are going to be additional proposals coming forth as soon as the coming weeks after President-elect Biden is sworn in. I know his team is already working with congressional leaders right now, working on the next couple packages. Like I mentioned, he'll be speaking, I believe, in the next 30, 40 minutes, kind of on his rollout of the policy plan for COVID-19. So we'll know more details here shortly, but I definitely think we'll see multiple packages moving forward. Obviously, the Dems will likely seek a large package, which they have with the ones they previously introduced last Congress. If you guys remember, there was the $3 trillion package that included a lot of state and local funding, higher education funding, more funding for a lot of other resources as well. But in any additional package, like I mentioned, they'll want to include state and local aid, which is good for education programs because the majority of education budgets come from the state and local governments. So we'll see additional funding through that, let alone dedicated education funding. You'll see various health provisions, unemployment assistance and protections, and then small business assistance. I imagine Republicans will likely argue again for narrow targeted packages for small businesses, people who lost their jobs, things like that. And I think they'll also start bringing back the argument of being concerned about the deficit and debt. So they'll really try to hamstring the amount of funding that'll go out. With that being said, it doesn't sound like we'll get 60 votes in the Senate. I think the Democrats will attempt to kind of achieve a lot of their large partisan provisions through the reconciliation process. And this was basically created by the Congressional Budget Act in 1974. It allows for basically expedient consideration of certain tax spending and debt limited legislation. The last two really big examples of it happening was back in 2017 when President Trump passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And then before that was in 2010 when the Obama administration passed the Affordable Care Act. So they're kind of the last two big examples of reconciliation. The reason why they'll take this approach is these bills aren't subject to the filibuster or the 60 vote threshold. Although the scope of amendments are limited, um, as long as it deals with funding or any type of budgetary issue, they usually can get through. They'll be allowed to get through, and this way they only need a simple majority. So I imagine we'll see a lot of additional stimulus payments, for example, money for state and local government, maybe some dedicated other funding. I think will all probably go through the reconciliation process, which the Democrats have the opportunity to do about 3 times in the next 2 years. So moving on to the FY22 appropriations. Again, I'll start with a recap of last year, kind of where we are. Like I mentioned before, the basic state grant for Perkins received its 4th straight increase. Last year, it received $52.25 million, bringing the new total to $1.334 billion. Although it was 4 straight years of Perkins increases, which is great, we're welcomed by the newfound focus and attention by Congress. We feel the community's needs aren't still being met, although these are welcome developments. Some other recaps as they relate to FY20 funding levels include adult education, which received about $18,000 more over FY20. The maximum Pell Grant was increased by $150. The Federal Work Study Program received an additional $10,000. The Career Pathways for Youth grants were level funded at $10 million. The Strengthening Community College Training grants received a $5 million increase. And lastly, the apprenticeship grant programs received an increase of $85 million. So starting with the process this year, we obviously expect it to start later than normal. Usually the president's budget is released the 1st or 2nd week of February. Oh, good question, John. I can address that right now, actually. He asked, are there discussions on the stimulus funding? Sorry, it just went away. Being provided to CTE, CTCs directly. So as of now, the funding distribution is kind of wonky, and we're going to write a more in-depth blog about that here in the next couple days. But currently, right now, all the funding goes to either 3 pots. One's K-12, one's higher ed, one's the governor's education relief fund, which is at the governor's discretion on spending. So basically, within that, it's really at the discretion of the state and local governments how the money is being spent. There is no dedicated funding for CTE programs. That's one of our priorities moving forward, is ensuring that there is some dedicated funding for CTE programs. And also, I forgot to mention too, so thank you for bringing this up. It's likely, so back last Congress during the COVID talks, House Democrats and Senate Democrats introduced a bill relaunching America's Workforce Act, which included about $15.6 billion for various workforce programs. And it also included $1 billion in dedicated funding for CTE. We're actually hearing from some of our counterparts on the Hill and other advocacy groups that there's a high likelihood that that's going to be included in one of the new relief proposals. We're not sure which one, whether it will be the relief or the recovery. Again, like I mentioned, we don't really know the breakdown of it, but we are hearing good news that hopefully some dedicated relief will be on the way. Yeah, so going back to, I hope that answered your question. If not, please follow up and I'll try to be more direct next time. So again, we imagine it's going to start late this year. Usually it doesn't in a president's first year anyway, because the budget process starts almost weeks after the inauguration. But this year, the combination of needs that need to be immediately addressed between COVID-19, the new administration, lack of cooperation up front with the transition team is really setting them behind schedule. But once the process starts, I expect there to be a large debate as it relates to spending levels and the rising debt deficit. Like I mentioned, we expect Republicans to kind of return to their call for concerns about the ballooning debt, and Democrats wanting to push large funding packages to assist states, localities, and families. So we really expect that to come to a head and probably delay the process a little bit like it has in the past couple years. Also a noteworthy event to kind of put on your radar is there will be likely further delay or complication in the process this year, because on August 1st is the expiration of the debt ceiling suspension. So 2 years ago, they passed, 2 years ago in the budget deal that they did, the 2-year budget deal they suspended the debt ceiling and budget caps. So we expect, with that being August 1st, that'll be a whole nother debate that needs to be addressed before the government is able to kind of increase debt loads. But going to our priorities for fiscal year 22, as of now, we're calling for a robust increase in funds for the basic state grant. It's really hard before seeing the president's budget and kind of hearing from congressional leaders to put a specific number out there. So from an advocacy standpoint, a robust increase kind of allows us to have more wiggle room with how we negotiate and things like that. But obviously, the argument is, given the backdrop of the additional costs incurred due to the pandemic, the recession and the economic reshuffle, there'll be an increased demand for CTE programs in the coming years, not just now, but proactively into the future, to kind of ensure that the shortages we see now in the healthcare sector, for example, isn't so in the future if this ever happens again. And again, I'd like to take this time to remind you guys that we'll be sending out action alerts like we do every year to have you guys reach out to your members of Congress. And like always, we encourage you to reach out to them. I just wanted to remind you again that the messages will probably be coming later than normal due to the process starting later. But like I said, given the new chairwoman on the Appropriations Committee on the House side, we do expect education to be prioritized. And we're feeling confident that we can potentially stretch this increase into a 5th year. Obviously, a lot of that depends on your guys' advocacy. So again, we really do rely on you guys and your support. We hear it directly from the members of Congress about how many people reached out to them on the topic, especially the chairwoman herself. She keeps tabs on a lot of this stuff. So the more support we can show behind the issue, the easier it makes our jobs, and the higher the likelihood of us getting an increase.
Yeah, I will definitely echo that comment from Mike. We rely so much on grassroots advocacy and the ability to bring that direct message about the importance of CTE to policymakers. Let's stop here again and see if anybody has questions more about the COVID-19 relief funding. We know that's kind of come in fits and starts and been kind of confusing at different times from the federal government. So we're happy to answer any of those questions, or about funding through the regular appropriations process. Anybody have questions we can answer here before we jump into other legislation? Okay. Well, I definitely encourage people to be on the lookout, as Mike mentioned, for this latest round of COVID-19 relief funding. The K-12 dollars and the governor's dollars have already been released to states just in the last week or so. And so you should start seeing from your state how to access those fundings at the K-12 level, and start to hear discussions about how governors will use those funds. And there were a couple of states last time around that had success getting some of those governor's funds directed specifically to CTE programs. The higher ed dollars that go to all institutions of higher education directly from the federal government have not been released yet. And those were some of the most kind of difficult and confusing to apply for last time. So we will definitely be following that and making sure everybody knows when those applications for higher ed funding are available for this latest round. And then of course, we'll be providing lots of information about potential new dollars that come out of those proposals that Mike was talking about. So with that, we'll carry on for our last few pieces of legislation.
Cool. So one big one that we expect happening within the first 100 days we're hearing it from not only the administration, but also members of Congress that it's highly anticipated and expected that we'll see some sort of comprehensive infrastructure proposal. And it's likely to include more than just your traditional infrastructure, your roads and bridges, but also include school construction, which was championed by the House Chairman Scott, climate change mitigation, renewable energy, among some other things, water infrastructure, sewage, things like that. It'll definitely contain some bipartisan pieces. Usually the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on high level things really are a fairly bipartisan committee. But I expect it'll remain largely partisan given the political backdrop and the partisan process it'll probably take. And also the biggest issue, usually the hang up with infrastructure bills always comes down to the pay for, whether they mess with the gas tax, find some other form of revenue. There's always a huge argument on the back end with that. So we expect the hang up to be there. But we're also kind of optimistic about it getting through. I know it's both parties, it's a high priority for both of them. It's a good messaging point for them to go back home. And it also can restart the economy in a time that we need it now. So we expect the bill to potentially be used as a coming together or unity moment, trying to unite Congress. But again, just like everything else, I expect it to fall apart, quite frankly. But as for our priorities for the bill, we obviously want to provide, within the bill, we want dedicated resources to develop and expand CTE programs of study. Obviously, when they last talked about infrastructure, the $2 trillion proposal, there was estimates that it would create 10 to 15 million new jobs. Obviously, these are different aspects. With infrastructure, it's not just construction, it's building, planning, maintaining, and operating. So it's really a lot of different CTE pathways that are and programs of study that are going to be used to kind of help get people into these roles. So we think dedicated resources are critically important because, as you guys know now, our workforce development programs are already overburdened and underfunded. Also, we want to see school infrastructure infrastructure funding in any comprehensive infrastructure proposal. Usually the federal government accounts for less than 1% of all school construction funding. The last time a large influx of federal dollars went into this was during the last recession back in 2009. But with schools, with the average age of schools nationwide being over 50 years old, we think it's time again for this to be included in any infrastructure package. Not only do we need to create a safer and more healthy environment for students, but we also need to ensure that our CTE programs have an up-to-date facility that'll allow them to effectively instruct their students. The last priority for us is closing the homework gap and narrowing the digital divide. We see that especially within rural communities, lower socioeconomic communities. And it's been really brought to light and further exacerbated with the pandemic and everybody working from home or going to school from home. So Higher Education Act, it feels like this is always up for reauthorization. The last time it was reauthorized was 2008. It used to be reauthorized every 5 years, but obviously that hasn't happened. So we feel a comprehensive proposal. We'll see comprehensive proposals coming from both parties, potentially both parties in both chambers, but any passage won't be comprehensive if there's one at all. We'll likely see it broken down into smaller pieces, whether it's used through the regular legislative process, the budget process, or reconciliation process. What really hung it up last year, there was actually a real bipartisan appetite last year to pass it between Senator Patty Murray and Senator then Chairman Alexander. But there was a few key issues that really hung it up and will keep it from getting that 60 votes threshold. A lot of it is Title IX and accountability issues, accreditation issues, student loan relief, and free college proposals are really what I think is going to hang it up. One good thing is we should see a renewed interest and attention for community colleges. The now chairwoman, Patty Murray, is a big proponent of community colleges, so we should see them take a more prominent role in federal policy, especially given that for all post-secondary federal funds, I believe about 9% of them go to community colleges, when community colleges educate the vast majority of post-secondary students. So we'll kind of see that gap closed. As for our priorities, the Jobs Act, which is basically extending Pell eligibility to short-term job training programs of 150 hours or more. That was a big thing for us. The caucus co-chairman, Tim Kaine, introduced it in the Senate. It's a really bipartisan, bicameral bill. A version of it was included in every comprehensive HEA reauthorization bill last year. Not exactly the Jobs Act, but it included short-term Pell in one way or another. So that was a welcomed development because in years past, it wasn't really even considered. Now we're seeing people opening up to the issue and understanding the importance of it. So we'll continue to advocate to make sure that as close to jobs as passed as possible. Another priority of ours is the College Transparency Act. So going back to the last reauthorization of HEA in 2008, now ranking member, so basically back in 2008, they had a federal ban on student level record data systems. It was really championed by now ranking member Virginia Fox, kind of as a privacy issue, student privacy issue and data issue. This bill would simply eliminate the ban on this data system. It's, again, bipartisan, bicameral. I think almost half of the House co-sponsored it. And to really show the breadth of ideology that supports it, the two Senate co-sponsors were Elizabeth Warren and Bill Cassidy. So if you know anything about either of them, they're on complete opposite sides of the political spectrum. So it really shows that this is a critically important issue that we really think will help drive smarter, more informed decision-making for prospective post-secondary students. And again, our third issue is CTE educator prep and development. Nationwide, there's a teacher shortfall, but even further so within the CTE educator profession. So protecting Title II and any way we can really advocate on behalf of our educators getting continued professional development, getting people into the field, we'll obviously advocate on behalf of. And then a fourth thing, not as important as the other ones, but I still think it's critical to mention, is improving the federal work study program. So the federal work study program is basically a program geared towards low-income students, and it allows them to get jobs, basically administrative jobs on campus to help pay for their student costs. Like I said, traditionally they've been geared towards, historically they were geared towards public service. So outside of working on campus, the other jobs are really at nonprofits. We think this program should be aligned to the student's program of study. So we really want to see students who are going to school for IT or healthcare, we really want them to be able to work in fields that will complement their studies that they're getting, to not only get them paid experience, but it'll also help them land a job after, and it will really help them conceptualize what they're going to be doing in the future. So that's another thing we'll be looking at. So workforce programs, out of all these pieces of legislation, I expect the reauthorization of the National Apprenticeship Act will probably be most likely to gain traction, just because I think it's the most bipartisan out of all of them. The others would, like I mentioned, would bring a certain partisan fight, which would lessen the ability to muster enough support in the Senate. With this being the case, obviously with any of these proposals, we would want to see any of them reauthorized, basically because they would provide Congress an opportunity to modernize our nation's workforce systems, and to ensure that job seekers can access employment, education, training, and support services to succeed in the labor market, and also match employers with skilled workers they need to compete in the global economy. So basically, we ask that any reauthorization of these programs should include, from a high level, strengthening connections between education and workforce development systems, increasing access to high quality training, the use of relevant labor market information to ensure that programs reflect the local economic needs, and also to provide adequate resources and support services for vulnerable populations. And these are some other issues. I don't really need to spend much time on these. I really just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of the other large issues that are really going to eat up a lot of time, a large portion of time in Congress. It's not just, unfortunately, it's not all just education and workforce policy Congress has to do, but this is what we expect a lot of the other major tenets of at least the first year of the 117th Congress to kind of take shape as.
All right, I think we'll pause there again. Does anybody have other policy questions as we wrap up? I have one question for you, Mike. If folks on the webinar or other CTE advocates, what's kind of one action you would like them to take, or one kind of piece of advice you'd give them for how to advocate here over the next couple of months, the most important things they can be doing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, first and foremost, creating a strong relationship with your member. This is even more important so if you have a new member of Congress. From my time working on the Hill, I always used you guys who live, breathe, and do this every day. I really used you guys as a crutch for any issue that kind of came up. So really creating that relationship, because as a policy staffer, I had 12 different issues. So basically any domestic issue except healthcare. So education and labor, workforce issues, financial services, taxes, transportation, telecommunications, energy, natural resources, and the list goes on. Like, I didn't have the time to become a policy expert in every single thing. It was more reactionary. So whenever a policy issue did come up that I didn't have time to get caught up to speed on or didn't fully understand, I kept a running list of all the contacts that I had in all the different policy areas. And I really came to you guys to kind of get me read in on the issue, understand on the ground level what's going on. And I say that because it's a great way for you guys to be the major policy influencer within CTE with your member of Congress. You can really help shape how they think of the issue. Because obviously we were in marble walls in DC. We didn't really understand what was going on the ground in Iowa or California, whatever your member represents. So it really does take that knowledge that you guys have that we just simply couldn't possess, getting that information to us. So being active and engaged, whether it's inviting them to virtual school visits so they can conceptualize your program, sending them fact sheets, whether it's local or state specific information, getting them involved in any way possible is really beneficial to help them understand the issue. Because a lot of people, you'll hear almost every member say they support career and technical education, but a lot of them don't fully understand it. They, on a 30,000 foot level, they support it, but it really takes you guys to help inform their policy decision making to make sure that when they do act on behalf of CTE, that they're doing it in a proper way and in a way that actually helps us as a community.
Yep. And now is definitely a great time to lay that foundation. While there aren't critical CTE issues pending, you can start to build that relationship so that, as Mike said, they'll pick up the phone and call you when they do have questions. One way you can certainly start to build that relationship and to learn more about federal policy is through our National Policy Seminar, which this year is going to be a virtual event. It's going to be happening the week of February 22nd, with most of the content structured into the afternoon of February 22nd, that Monday, and then a virtual visits and a virtual school visit later in the week. So we invite you to check that out and register for it if you haven't already. I also, as we wrap up, wanted to mention just a few resources that I hope you have already used and benefited from, but just in case you don't know about them, our CTE Policy Watch blog is where we post all of the most up-to-date information on what's happening. You know, several times a week we'll post on the blog, as well as each Monday or Tuesday, depending on the timing, we post a recap of all of the things that have happened in the prior week in Congress, just to give you a short, condensed piece of information that you can take a look at. That blog post is called DC Digest, but you'll find it and other stories on the blog. We also have our ACTE Action Center, where you can go directly on our website, put in your zip code, pull up your members of Congress, send messages. We'll have pre-populated messages at different times when we need you to take action on specific issues, but you can also just use that as a way to start that dialogue with your members of Congress. And then we have a host of other advocacy resources as well. And then finally, here's how to connect with us on social media. Get our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts, and we try to post all of our kind of policy news on this ACTE policy Twitter account in particular, and then it gets farmed out to other social media platforms across the organization. And of course, you can also email myself or Mike at any time. We're really here to help you connect with policymakers and to solve problems when we can on the federal policy space. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions or concerns as we go through this next year. So with that, I know we are just about out of time, but we're happy to stick around for just a minute if anybody does have any final questions. But otherwise, we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, and Alicia, just to piggyback, if you guys want to reach out to your members of Congress and need help either getting in touch with their staff or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to get you in touch with them if you want to set up a meeting or anything else.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks everybody for joining us today.